Alright, let's continue with circular flow thinking. And what you see on this slide is probably the simplest version of a circular economy. It only consists of two markets, the market for goods and services and the market for production factors. And there are only two economic actors, the households and the firms. And as I mentioned in the earlier video, the circular thinking of economic activity, that is something that you mostly find in macroeconomics. So when you see here the economic actor households and firms, what that means is those are all the households and all the firms within an economy. So we lump them together, and that is something that macroeconomists do a lot. They lump together economic actors. Like here we have two, the households and the firms. Okay, so what you see here is blue arrows and green arrows, and the blue arrows is a circle that represents the real sector of the economy. So the real sector of the economy, that is everything that's being produced, all the production factors and the final goods. That constitutes the real sector of the economy. The green arrows, that is associated with monetary flows, and they work against the flow of the real sector. Basically what that captures is that whenever somebody is producing something in real terms and sells it on a market, then that person receives income. So every expenditure has to be somebody else's income. But let's just start now with looking at those blue arrows and start with the households. So the households, they supply on the market for production factors, land, labor, and capital. And what is important to understand is that in economics, economists only know three production factors. The three production factors are land, labor, and capital. But there's an important difference between land, labor, and capital. So when it comes to land, land captures technically also water resources like fisheries, that's land, but land is mostly arable land, which is being used for the cultivation of crops, again, lakes, rivers, oceans, that is technically part of land. Or land is something, a production factor where we can build a factory or residential areas. So that is all land. And labor, that is basically the workers that we have. But whenever we speak of labor, what we mean is unskilled labor. So you, as a student, you are currently accumulating human capital. So labor is mostly unskilled labor, whereas a worker who gets skilled and or develops certain skills or receives certain training, that worker would migrate from the production factor of labor into human capital, which is capital. So the point here is that land and labor, they are readily available, but capital needs to be accumulated. And whenever we speak of capital, what we do not refer to is money or stocks or those kind of things. Capital is also real capital. Capital means it is something that's being used to produce final goods and services. So capital is being used to produce final goods and services, and it needs to be accumulated. Land and labor is readily available. So households, they supply on the market for production factors whatever land and labor and capital that they have, and it is being demanded by the firms, who then use land, labor, and capital to convert them into goods and services, Then they supply the goods and services on the market for goods and services, where they are being demanded again by the households. So that essentially describes the blue arrow, which is a circular flow of the real sector of the economy. And it starts with land, labor, and capital, which are being demanded by the firms in order to produce goods and services, which in turn demand the households. So now let's move to the green arrows and start again with the households. So whenever they supply land, labor, and capital, they receive income. And that income is rent, wage, and interest. So you probably can already tell that economists, they use the term rent for the production factor, that is the income for that somebody receives when someone offers land. So land receives rent, and labor receives a wage. So let's write that down. So rent, that goes to the production factor of land. Wage is what goes to labor, and interest income, that is what goes to capital. So in economics we have only three production factors: land, labor, and capital. And we also have different names for the income that they receive, and those terms are rent for land, wage for labor, and interest for capital. Okay, so the households supply land, labor, and capital and receive rent, wage, and interest income. And for the firms, those are of course rent, wage, and interest expenditures. But once the firms supply the goods and services and they sell their goods and services on the market for goods and services, they receive income, and we call those revenues and profits. So the difference between revenues and profits is that revenue is simply the price times the quantity, and of course for all the goods. But profit is total revenue minus total cost. So the remainder of the revenue minus total cost, that is profit. And of course for the households to obtain the goods and services, they have consumption expenditures. So the consumption expenditures by households, they constitute revenues and profits for the firms, and then the firms, they use their revenues and profits in order to pay rent, wages, and interest expenditures, and that is rent, wage, and interest income for the households. So this is the basic nature of the circular flow, and there are different circular flows within an economy. Like in free trade, we can observe a certain circularity, if that's a word, and then in a simple macroeconomic model we see that. And I think at this point that the basic idea is clear, but at the later stage of the course we will come back to that graph, and actually you will see that graph later again when we talk about the national accounting system and how we calculate GDP, because then this model will constitute the basis of the national accounting system. But let's just stop here. The point is that you need to be able to think in circular terms and see those connections, and understand that economics is not a one-way, unidirectional thinking, so that circularity shows up over and over again. All right, so let's stop here.